If you watch the video on the day it comes out, then tomorrow will be the release of the new F1 movie, F1 the Movie. We will finally be able to see what the last few years of hard work on this movie have led to. But this isn't the first movie about F1. In fact, there have been multiple films about Formula 1, even about motorsport in general. So, because this suits as a good opportunity for a little movie comparison, I've decided to go through some motorsport movies and to talk a little bit about them. And before we start, I would like to bring out a spoiler alert because I'll be talking about the story of all these films mentioned. So if you haven't seen one of them, then better tune in next time. Alright, with that out of the way, I would like to start with the first movie on this list, which is Grand Prix from 1966. And even though the movie is quite a few years old, it still enjoys a lot of popularity among motorsport and car enthusiasts, but more about that later. So in this movie, we follow 4 drivers among a fictional version of the 1966 F1 season. Namely, we have Jean-Pierre Sarti, a multiple-time world champion who's getting towards the end of his career and is starting to get more and more upset with the danger of racing in the 60s. Nino Barlini, a charismatic young Italian who lives life to the fullest and is number 2 driver to Jean-Pierre Sarti at Ferrari because he is seen as a possible future world champion. Scott Stoddart, a rapid British man who drives for the Jordan BRM team, who still has to cope with the death of his brother, and Pete Aaron, an American who wants to come back to the success he had in the past, proving that he has still what it takes to be a world champion. And if these names sound somewhat familiar to you, it's because they're orientated on the actual racing drivers. So Jean-Pierre Sarti is John Surtees, Nino Barlini is Lorenzo Bandini, Stoddart is Stewart, and Pete Aaron represents Richie Ginther. So the movie starts with the drivers getting ready for the Monaco Grand Prix, which also shows what makes this movie so special. Because what this movie does from time to time is showing us actual racing footage on F1 circuits from the 60s with F1 cars from the 1960s. And even up until today, these scenes are made so well that they act as a sort of time capsule, making it possible for us to experience not only how it was to drive an F1 car in the 1960s with all its pros and cons, but also what it was like to be a fan with these cars flying past you at blistering speeds. These racing scenes are also the main part of the movie, which are only being paused by some storytelling, which acts as a sort of glue to make it possible to transition from one Grand Prix to another. And in these storytelling scenes, we have a combination of actual problems that racing drivers had back in the 60s because their job was really dangerous, and also these typical movie stuff like relationship problems or affairs. But apart from that, the racing season goes on. We see our drivers having multiple accidents throughout the season, with Stoddart almost dying after a massive crash with Aaron at the Monaco Grand Prix. And after all of this, with a little bit happening in between, we end up at the final race in Monza, where Sarti, Stoddart, Barlini and Aaron are in a winner-takes-all situation for the title. At the start, Sarti experiences some problems, throwing him to the back of the grid, with him now having to go through the entire field in order to still win the title. Unfortunately, during his recover, a loose part from the car in front causes Sarti to have a fatal accident in which he flies off one of the Monza bankings. After Ferrari hears about this, they decide to withdraw Barlini's car from the race in order to pay some respect for a possibly fatal accident of his teammate. So now we have a 2-horse race between Stoddart and Aaron for the title. The two of them are fighting through the final phase of the race, with them coming side by side towards the finishing line, with Aaron being just a bit ahead, giving him the world championship. First, Aaron is celebrating his title before he hears that Sarti has passed away from his crash, once again reminding us that racing back then was extremely dangerous. The movie ends with Aaron walking across the empty track, listening to the sounds of the start the day before. But even though the ending to the movie is quite grim, for me, this is still a very good motorsport movie. As I already mentioned, this movie acts as a sort of time capsule, making it possible for people like me to experience the raw nature of the sport, without all the glittering and the glamour, just the pure nature of racing. And as a cherry on top, we see multiple F1 drivers having cameo appearances in the movie, making it even better for us racing fans. But it wouldn't take long until we will get the next motorsport-focused movie with Le Mans from 1970. Here, we have the rivalry between American Michael Delaney in his Porsche and the German Eric Staller in his Ferrari for the win of the prestigious 24 Hours of Le Mans. But this rivalry is only important to a certain amount because there isn't really any story that is being told in the movie. Instead, we are greeted with minute-long silent racing scenes and some legendary cars that go through the old version of Le Mans. It is almost like Grand Prix, just that it has kicked out even the last bits of storytelling to replace it with even more racing scenes. Especially the start of the movie shows its characteristics very well, where, almost 40 minutes into the movie, not even a single word was spoken by any of the actors. Instead, you see the final few minutes before the start of the race, with the fans getting to their seats, the mechanics preparing the last things on the car, and the drivers getting ready for their first stint in it. And especially here, you can see that the producers not only care about motorsport, but that they also wanted to bring the feeling as close as possible to the viewer of what it was like to be a driver only seconds away from the start of the 24 hours of Le Mans. For me, these were one of the best scenes in the movie. This doesn't mean, however, that the rest of the movie isn't any good. The racing action on track is very good and very realistic. In fact, the producers used some footage of the actual 24-hour race in 1970. But apart from these well-made scenes, the race between Delaney and Staller goes on. The two of them are fighting against each other until Delaney has a crash, having to switch to another car in order to still be in the race. With Delaney back in the race, the fight between Staller and him carries on until the final few minutes of the race where, besides the two, one of Delaney's teammates is in a freeway fight for the win. But here, instead of going for the win himself, Delaney defends off Staller from behind in order to make it possible for his teammate to win the race. And even though it isn't the result that you would have expected, for me, this is still a very well-made motorsport movie. The scenes of some legendary cars going around an old version of the Le Mans circuit, plus the almost documentary-like version of the movie, makes it a very unique kind of movie for me as a motorsport fan. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about Driven. Here, we are in a fictional version of the 2000 kart series, with Jimmy Bly, a rookie to the series, wanting to go straight to the top, beating Bo Brandenburg, the previous champion. He's experiencing some problems in the beginning of the season, and so his team boss decides to bring back ex-racing driver and veteran to the series Joe Tanto in order to help him find his boundaries. The season goes on with some highs and lows for Bly, a love triangle, and several other side storylines that are going on throughout the season. And it once again comes down to the final race of the season, where Brandenburg, Bly, and Tanto are in a freeway fight for the championship. Here, we would see several crashes and a spectacular move from Tanto, with Bly and Brandenburg going for a drag race to the line, with Bly just being a tad bit ahead, giving him the title. And by the way I'm going through this movie, you can guess that I'm not a really big fan of this movie, at least of what it is supposed to be, because for me, this isn't a movie that wants to properly represent motorsport. It can be a good movie, and it can be actually fun, if you don't see it as a realistic movie with good racing scenes and a good storyline, but not if you want to see it as a proper attempt to show the viewer what motorsport means. Even the racing scenes do have so many errors and so many unrealistic crashes inside of them that it is a pain to watch for someone who actually cares about the sport. That, together with the poor storyline, makes it something that actually hurts the reputation of motorsport. And as I already said, you can make a fun and silly motorsport movie if you don't take yourself too serious, like Talladega Night does, for example. Here, a lot of weird and unrealistic things happen throughout the movie, but because you clearly know that the film doesn't take itself serious, it is actually a fan favorite among motorsport fans. But for Driven, this was a poor attempt to bring people closer to the topic of motorsport. A movie that has done that much better is Rush. Here, we follow Niki Lauda and James Hunt through their legendary fight for the 1967 F1 World Championship. And even though the rivalry and the season itself are a very interesting story to tell, I'm not going to go through it in this video, because otherwise this would be over an hour long, and so instead I'm going to recommend to you Josh Revel's video about the 1976 F1 season. What I would like to talk about instead is how the movie represented the rivalry between Hunt and Lauda, because this was one of the first motorsport movies that, instead of having a completely fictional story, you would have an original one from real life that you would then follow along throughout your movie. Even the two almost complete opposite characters of Lauda and Hunt would have been enough for a motorsport movie itself. On one hand, you had Lauda, the calm and calculating driver, that would spend a lot of time on understanding his car in order to set it up properly for him to make it best suitable to put on the fastest lap time. While James Hunt was the complete opposite. Not only had he an aggressive driving style, but he was also interested in several other things off track. Unlike Lauda, who was mainly focused on his job as a racing driver during the weekend. But despite all of this, they were, unlike the movie depicts, actual friends. Not only some acquaintances, but actual mates that had not only lived together, but also travelled through Europe in their time in Formula 3, as they later said themselves. However, The story that has been told still works, because even though it might be presented a little bit more heated up than it actually was, it can still happen that a friendship between two drivers can go aside when the two are going for the World Championship. A good example for this would be the friendship between Hamilton and Rosberg from 2014 to 2016, because they as well spent multiple years in the junior categories together, becoming friends, until 2014 when both of them were at Mercedes being able to fight for the World Championship. But apart from the story being told between Lauda and Hunt, the action on track is also pretty good as well. You can see that the production team behind the movie not only cared about motorsport, but that they also wanted to show the rivalry between Lauda and Hunt in a proper and somewhat realistic way. And as someone who's been unfortunate enough to not being able to see it myself, I can say that they made a pretty good job. As I already said, the combination between the story that has been told between Lauda and Hunt, together with the action on track, makes this a movie that is worth these two legendary F1 drivers. And a movie who's gone in a similar direction is Le Mans 1966, or Ford vs Ferrari, whatever you call it. It tells the fight between Ford and Ferrari for the win at the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans. By going back several years when Ford wanted to buy the almost broke Ferrari team, but had been tricked into a fake deal from the Italians because they only wanted to raise the price for Fiat, and leading them to decide that they wanted to build their own race team in order to beat Ferrari at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And in this story, we follow Ken Miles, an absolutely rapid but also somewhat difficult driver to handle, and Carroll Shelby, an absolutely automotive legend who not only raced himself but also had his own car company called Shelby American. Throughout the movie, we follow the project from Ford along, from its start to the first unsuccessful tries at Le Mans to its finally successful one in 1966. And even though it sounds like a perfect ending for Miles, it actually isn't, because even though he's been able to take part in Le Mans in 1966 for the first time, because the years before the team didn't allow him to go there because he was somewhat of a difficult character, and being able to lead the race, Ford decided that he should actually finish in formation with the other two drivers, which led to him losing the race to Bruce McLaren because he had travelled the longer distance throughout the 24 hours. And even though our main character isn't winning in the end, for me this is another great motorsport movie. The story and the development of the team and the main characters throughout the years, as well as the action on track, is all done pretty well, even though some of the racing shots have probably been done on a computer. You can somewhat compare it to Rush, even though the most part of the racing scenes are happening in the latter stage of the film at the actual 24-hour race, instead of having multiple racing scenes throughout the movie like Rush did. And what is also quite unique about the film is that instead of following two drivers in a rivalry, we here follow teams throughout several years of development of a rivalry that would end in one race at Le Mans. But even though there are less racing scenes and more storytelling throughout the film, for me, as I already said, it is still a really well made movie. And now, we come to the last movie on this list, which is the story about Jan Mardenborough in the film Gran Turismo. Here, we follow the already mentioned Mardenborough from his dream to be a racing driver to actually getting one. It starts off with him playing Gran Turismo in his childhood bedroom, something that he does most of the time. And he does this because he loves motorsport and dreams about being a racing driver himself, even though he doesn't have the financial possibilities for it at all. But one day, his once-in-a-lifetime chance comes up when Sony and Gran Turismo set up a program that wants to find the fastest esports driver in the world. And so Jan goes for this chance and actually qualifies for the next round. Here, he will battle multiple other competitors in real-life challenges in order to decide who will get a contract with Nissan for an actual race program. It all comes down to one race where Mardenborough just gets through in order to win the competition and to get the contract with Nissan. But despite having secured the contract, his future in motorsport is still not safe, as he still has to prove himself that he can keep up with the real racing drivers. And so Mardenborough has to finish fourth in at least one race in order to prove himself for the team and to get a proper contract with the team. And despite multiple challenges on the way, he would actually get this fourth place, giving him a proper racing contract with Nissan. And his reward was a place in a Nissan car for the 24 Hours of Le Mans. But despite being able to take part in one of the biggest races on the planet, Mardenborough can't focus because he is still somewhat traumatized from a crash at the Nürburgring he had several months ago. Fortunately for him, his race engineer gives him a pep talk, which brings him back to his form and allows him to just secure third place in his class, giving him a podium finish in his first try at Le Mans. Now, I do know that the story isn't being told in chronological order. For example, his Le Mans podium finish came before his big crash at the Nürburgring. But despite all of this, I still think the story is told really well. The story of Marlborough is presented pretty well, and the racing action on track, despite all being filmed on the Hungaroring, which is clearly not Le Mans, which the movie tries to tell us, is also done pretty well. But I mean, a story like this from real life is something that is too good to not be made into a movie. So for me, this has not only been a good representation of Jan Marlborough's story, but also another good motorsport movie. And with this new F1 movie coming out soon, we have the possibility to see if it is actually something good, or if all the years of hard work had led to something like Driven. But what do you think about the new F1 movie? Are you going to watch it? And what about the other movies that I've mentioned before? Have you seen all of them? And if you haven't, which one would you like to see yourself? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, feel free to subscribe, and until then, I'll see you next time.